Du Fu regarding this spring. The nation is torn apart, but mountains and rivers remain. It's spring in the city. Grass and trees grow thick. Feeling the times, flowers drip with tears. Seeing us parted, birds shriek heart-rending cries. Soldiers' beacons have burned 3 months in a row. I'd give 10,000 in gold for a letter from home. I scratch my white hair, shorter still. Soon it will be too thin to hold a hatpin. So we continue with Du Fu's pentasyllabic regulated poems. Now, most of these poems are pretty famous and they usually make it to different translations. But if I had to single out one poem, or if not a poem, at least one line that is probably the most famous line of Du Fu, and it's the only line by Du Fu that I remember by heart, it's the first one in this very poem. The nation is torn apart, but mountains and rivers remain. So this line could pretty much summarize the gist of Du Fu's poetry. So he was a poet that lived in troubled times with high Confucian values. He saw the chaos of the Anlushan rebellion, but, he still persisted in trying to do what was right, in serving the state, and in perceiving through the suffering of the people, not only the chaos of the rulers, but the suffering of the common people, the constant elements, the nation that suffers under hardship and the people that suffer under that hardship, whatever the political regime. The stable things, the natural background, but also the people. So, as is pretty obvious, the topic of this poem is very similar to the one we read yesterday. This is desolation, sadness at the country suffering and at the personal suffering of Du Fu in the aftermath of the Anlushan rebellion. The city which is talked about is the capital. The capital is occupied, the country is in chaos, in war, and as to contrast with this, nature seems to come back again with all its perennial renaissance, with its perennial beauty, with its cycle, so in contrast with the human cycle that seems to catch up with it here. So the topic is, and we will comment about it in a minute, the contrast, or the possible contrast, or the tension between nature's perennial renewal and societies following different cycles or not following cycles at all. Human misery, whether it is the individual Du Fu's misery at getting old and living in troubled times, or the misery of the capital or of all the people in China during this rebellion. So this is a very commented poem. Let's start giving it a look couplet by couplet and making a few commentaries on each. So the famous couplet. The nation is torn apart, but mountains and rivers remain. It's spring in the city. Grass and trees grow thick. So in a regulated poem, it is very typical in a pentasyllabic regulated poem, it's very typical for the first two characters to compose a word or a binomial compound that expresses one idea. There's a caesura after the second character, and then the next three characters also compose a union of their own. So here this is very clear. In the first part of the first line, we've got nation broken, which, means it's symbolically strong by itself and character by character. Nation broken, but together it means, the nation is in chaos, in peril. In the second part, we have mountains, rivers remain. Mountains and rivers are generally used together to mean the landscape. So there is this contrast, there is this antithesis that is being played within the first line of the poem. There seems to be a contrast between society, which is in chaos, in warfare, and nature, which is the stable element, the thing that perdures. Okay, this connects us with, many views of the study of history and societies. As you know, things don't have the same time clocks. So individuals have a time clock that is limited to at most 80, 90, 100 years. Societies and empires or political institutions have a longer life than individuals. They can live for hundreds of years. Religions or more abstract things can live for thousands of years. And then you have the geology and the natural world, while specific plants and animals can, be extinguished in relatively little time. Geology and the big cycles of nature occupy millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years. So one way to read this line is a contrast. So the poet is contrasting political chaos with natural cycles and natural renaissance. I think we have mentioned before that a very common streak in Chinese philosophical thought since at least the Warring States period, in fact it became the orthodoxy during the Han, was Chinese correlative thought, the idea that between the macrocosm and the microcosm, between nature and society, there is a deep connection. That is to say, they're not independent realms. There is a rational, impersonal force called heaven. This force is the origin of the laws of nature, which for the Chinese were basically Jing Jiang, the five elements and so on, and the normal cycle of the seasons. And this Tian, this heaven, is also the creator of morality. And it interferes in politics, so that when government, when rulers are not virtuous and moral, heaven sends disasters, natural disasters or political disasters, famines, plagues, invasions, to curb the rulers, to teach them, hey, you're on the wrong path. If you keep like that, you're going to lose the empire. And if the rulers don't reform, dynastic change happens. So after the Han Dynasty, even in the Han Dynasty, this sort of worldview was, disputed by some, but it always remains deeply ingrained in Chinese psychology. And in poetry, it's also quite present, and here it resonates with universal poetical attitudes towards nature, what in the West critics have called the pathetic fallacy. The idea in a poem that nature, animals, the plants can respond to human feeling and human sentiment. So one way of interpreting this first line is as a complaint, as a protest. How can nature remain? How can the rivers and the mountains renew themselves? In the second line, how can spring, the trees and the grasses come back to the city as if nothing had happened, as if everything was as usual when we're experiencing a climatic, possibly unforgettable fall of a dynasty and massive chaos and human suffering and warfare. That's one way of reading it. Another way of reading it would be not so much putting the emphasis on the contrast or recriminating nature for being nature. Another focus could be the focus on the long things, on the long structure. So the poet might be thinking, yes, our human glory, our power, our dynasties, our lives are brief, but some things are stronger and they will remain. So here it seems more like a consolation message in the midst of warfare and chaos. It's the idea that some things will remain. Everything that I hold dear, this country, this dynasty which I'm serving, the gilded society of culture and civilization in Chang'an, the greatest capital in the world, all this will be blown away. All this is in chaos, but some things will endure. There's a very famous Latin quotation, omnia mutatur nihil interit, from the Metamorphoses of Ovid. It is everything changes, but nothing truly goes away. And I think there's a bit of that spirit in this couplet. So nature will resist, and probably the people, not individual people, but the nation, the soul of the nation, our civilization, will survive this cataclysmic catastrophe that we are experiencing. Anyway, the second line also shows a very weird image. The city is covered with grass and trees. The city is no longer the human abode. Because of the chaos and the invasion, the city has been sacked. Many people have been murdered. Others have run away. The city is being reconquered by nature. So that's another way of interpreting these lines, like how fragile is the human stranglehold over the world. Just a little handicap, and the city becomes invaded by nature again. Anyway, this first couplet has presented us this view and this contrast of nature and civilization, of political chaos versus natural cyclical renewal. The second couplet, which is the first parallelistic couplet, as you'll remember, seems to go in the line of the pathetic fallacy and seems to push us to interpret the first couplet in that line, because in there we get nature seemingly responding to the affections of the poet. But of course you can also read it the other way around. You can read it as the poet projecting feelings that he feels into nature. Feeling the times, flowers drip with tears, seeing us parted, birds shriek heart-rending cries. So we have flowers crying and birds shrieking. And they seem to be moved by the times, or by Du Fu and his relatives and friends being separated. So the poet is imagining that the flowers are crying. You might imagine seeing dew over the flowers in a spring morning or after a short rain, and constructing those drops on top of the flowers as the flowers crying. And well, you would hear birds shrieking as usual. You could construct those shrieks as laments in solidarity to your own suffering at parting from friends. But anyway, this line continues this contrast between nature and society, but here it seems to have been solved by nature sympathizing, by nature empathizing with the empire's weakness and with Du Fu's own frustrations and sufferings from separation from his family in this historical context. Okay, so this second couplet continues with nature. The third couplet pushes us back to society. It takes us away from nature and it takes us to the problems of warfare and the effects the warfare is having on Du Fu and on the people. Soldiers' beacons have burned 3 months in a row. I'd give 10,000 in gold for a letter from home. So the war has been going on for quite some time. The An Lushan rebellion took many, many, many years to extinguish, and the empire was never the same afterwards. I mean, big swathes of north and northeastern China became autonomous for the remainder of the dynasty in the hands of their military governors, the Yedushi. So already when this poem is composed, 3 months of long war have been going on. Soldiers' beacons, so you will remember The Lord of the Rings, the movie or the book, and beacon fires were typical in ancient societies as ways in which armies could warn each other when they were at a certain distance. So these beacon fires are a mute form of communication that has been spreading the news of the ongoing conflict. There's a paradox or a contrast between this communication, which has been going on for 3 months, and the lack of other communication, the letters that Du Fu wants to receive from his family, which because of the chaos and the warfare cannot arrive at the capital. And he would give 10,000 in gold, hyperbolically. He would give an enormous sum to receive any news from home, from his wife, from his children, hearing that they are fine or at least alive. So 2 forms of communication that are either created or interrupted by warfare, and that take us back to the human realm. Finally, the last couplet not only takes us back to the human realm, it takes us to Du Fu's personal suffering and preoccupations, which already were introduced perhaps in the last line of the previous couplet, in his desire for a letter from home. I scratch my white hair, shorter yet. Soon it will be too thin to hold a hairpin. So nature renews itself, but men do not. We grow old, and after we grow old, we die. Du Fu, in the midst of this crisis, is growing old. He's scratching his hair. This scratching of his hair is a very common trope in a lot of Chinese poems to represent, bedazzlement, confusion, negative surprise, inability to think clearly. So in a state of chaotic civil war, the poet is also in a state of personal confusion on what to do and how to understand, how to interpret things, how to find a way out for himself and for his country. And he scratches his head. so much. He's so worried and has been scratching so much, worried for people, country, and family, that few hairs remain in his head. This is a bit hyperbolic, but getting older, you lose hair as well. And he says, very soon it will be too thin, my hair, to hold a hairpin. And this is symbolic because one of the symbols of office in Tang China was a special type of cap that was worn by the scholar officials and that was pinned through a hair clip to your hair. So what Du Fu is really saying, he's not really talking about being worried about having few hairs in his head. He's talking about soon I will be too old and worn and destroyed by aging, suffering, and all the conflict to keep on serving. So my time of life is drawing to a close. My time of serving in office is drawing to a close as well, in the midst of all this chaos and warfare. So the poem ends on a quite bleak note, but we should go back to the beginning and remember that mountains and rivers remain. Du Fu would survive the Alishan rebellion. He would reunite with his family under quite tough circumstances. I think some of his children died of starvation. I don't know if during the rebellion or afterwards. He would be back at the capital with the troops of Emperor Suzong, but very soon he would be dismissed from central office and sent to the provinces. We will read about that in a couple of poems' time. And after that, he would start wandering through the west, through Shu, and then through the Yangtze River Valley, where he would die. So dark times were coming for Du Fu, at least a little bit darker than the time before the rebellion. But yet, there was hope for the country, for the people, for his family. Yeah? Things would somewhat recover, and the Tang would still manage to get a further lease of life of about 150 years, during the first 50 of which, 50, a bit more, it still managed to create wonderful poetry and to organize a relatively well-working and efficient society.